After 10 years of keeping me and my wife away from our son, my daughter-in-law invited us to visit them in Los Angeles. When we arrived, we found the house empty. That's when a neighbor shouted, "They've been in jail for 8 years." When I asked why, I froze. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The phone rang at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the quiet of our kitchen like a blade. Martha was pouring her second cup of coffee, and I was reading the sports section when that familiar number flashed on the caller ID, a number we hadn't seen in 10 years. Sarah? My hands trembled as I reached for the phone. Martha's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw the same mixture of hope and dread that I felt churning in my stomach. "Norman?" Sarah's voice was softer than I remembered, almost fragile. "It's me, it's Sarah." I cleared my throat, trying to find words that had been buried under a decade of silence. "Sarah, this is unexpected." I know it's been a long time." There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. "Norman, David wants to see you. Both of you." The words hit me like a physical blow. David, my son. The boy I'd taught to throw a baseball, to drive a stick shift, to tie his shoes. The man who'd disappeared from our lives the moment he said, "I do." "He wants to see us," I repeated, and Martha dropped her coffee mug. It shattered against the kitchen floor, but neither of us moved to clean it up. "Yes, he's been talking about you and Martha a lot lately, about how much he misses you both." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "We're in Los Angeles now. David has been doing really well with his career, and we have this beautiful house in Westwood. He keeps saying the house feels empty without family." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, afraid I might be dreaming. "Sarah, it's been 10 years. 10 years of nothing, no calls, no visits, no Christmas cards. You told us we were too controlling, that we needed to give you space. I know, and I'm sorry about that. I was young and scared, and I thought I knew what was best for our marriage." She paused again. "But David never stopped loving you. He talks about the workshop you two built together, about the fishing trips. He wants his children to know their grandparents." Children. My heart nearly stopped. "We have grandchildren?" "2 beautiful kids. Emma is 8, and little James just turned 5. They look just like David did when he was their age." Sarah's voice grew warmer. "Emma has your eyes, Norman, that same serious expression you get when you're concentrating." I had to sit down. Martha was staring at me, tears already streaming down her face. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand. "Why now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "After all this time, why are you calling now?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Because life is short, Norman. Too short for this kind of separation. David realized that success doesn't mean anything if you don't have family to share it with. We want to fix this. We want to try again." The rational part of my mind, the part that had been burned before, whispered warnings. But the father in me, the grandfather who'd never held his grandchildren, was drowning out every doubt. "When?" I asked. "This weekend? I know it's short notice, but David is between projects right now, and the kids are on spring break from school. It would be perfect timing." I looked at Martha, who was nodding so vigorously I thought she might hurt her neck. We'd been married for 42 years, and I could read her face like a book. She was terrified and hopeful and desperate all at once. "Okay," I heard myself saying. "We'll come." Sarah let out what sounded like a sob of relief. "Oh, Norman, you don't know how happy this makes me. David is going to be over the moon." She gave me an address in Westwood, a nice area from what I remembered of Los Angeles. We arranged for Saturday afternoon, giving us time to make the 6-hour drive from Phoenix. After I hung up, Martha and I sat in silence for a long time, staring at each other across the wreckage of her coffee mug. "You think it's real?" she finally asked. "You think they really want us there?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that my son had finally come to his senses, that Sarah had realized what she'd cost all of us. But 10 years of hurt doesn't heal with one phone call. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we have to try. If there's even a chance." Martha nodded, already reaching for her purse. "I need to go shopping. I need to buy presents for the children." "Oh God, Norman, we have grandchildren." The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Martha bought enough toys and clothes to fill a small store, insisting that she had 8 and 5 years of birthdays and Christmases to make up for. I found myself digging through old photo albums, looking for pictures of David as a child to show to Emma and James. The night before we left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen my son at their wedding 10 years ago. He'd looked so happy, so in love. Sarah had been beautiful in her white dress, charming and gracious to all our friends and family. I remembered thinking that maybe I'd been wrong about her, that maybe the tension I'd sensed during their engagement was just pre-wedding nerves, but then came the gradual pulling away. First, they were too busy to visit for Martha's birthday. Then David couldn't make it to my retirement party because of work. Christmas became a phone call that grew shorter each year, until even those stopped. When we tried to visit them in their first apartment, Sarah always had an excuse. David was working late, or they had other plans, or she wasn't feeling well. Every attempt at connection was met with a polite but firm rejection. The final blow came 3 years after the wedding, when I called to invite them for Thanksgiving. Sarah answered, and her voice was cold as winter. "Norman, I think it's time we were honest with each other. David and I have been talking, and we feel like you and Martha are too involved in our lives. We need space to build our own family traditions. Sarah, we just want to be part of your lives. We love David, and we want to love you too. Love shouldn't feel like pressure, Norman. David feels guilty every time he talks to you because he knows you disapprove of our choices. It's not healthy for our marriage." I tried to argue, to explain that we'd never meant to make David feel guilty about anything. But Sarah was done with the conversation. "We'll call when we're ready. Please don't contact us until then." And that was it. 10 years of silence. But now, lying in bed next to Martha as she slept fitfully, I allowed myself to hope. People change. Priorities shift. Maybe becoming parents had helped David and Sarah understand what they'd given up. Maybe we were finally going home. The morning sun was just breaking over the mountains as we loaded our car for the drive to Los Angeles, our hearts full of cautious hope and 10 years' worth of love waiting to be given. The highway stretched ahead of us like a ribbon of possibility, but the silence in our car was thick with unspoken fears. Martha sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, clutching a small photo album she'd put together the night before. Pictures of David from birth to college graduation. A visual timeline of the son we'd lost. "What if they've changed their minds?" she asked for the third time since we'd left Phoenix. "What if we get there and they don't want to see us?" I reached over and squeezed her hand. Her wedding ring, worn thin after 42 years, caught the morning light. Then, at least we'll know we tried. But inside, I was asking myself the same questions. The call from Sarah had felt almost too good to be true. After 10 years of complete silence, why now? What had really changed? As we drove through the desert, I found myself remembering the David I'd raised. The boy who used to help me in my workshop every Saturday, standing on a milk crate so he could reach the workbench. His small hands would hold the nails while I hammered, his face serious with concentration. "Dad, are you building this right?" he'd ask, peering at my work with those intense brown eyes he'd inherited from my father. "What do you think, son? Does it look right to you?" He'd study whatever project we were working on with the gravity of a master craftsman, then nod solemnly. "It looks perfect, Dad." Those were the moments I treasured most. Not the baseball games or the fishing trips, though those were wonderful too. It was the quiet times in the workshop, just the two of us creating something together. David had real talent with his hands, a natural understanding of how things fit together. I'd always imagined that someday we'd work side by side as adults, maybe even start a business together, father and son, building something meaningful. Instead, I was driving across the desert to meet grandchildren I'd never seen, hoping my son still remembered those Saturday mornings. "Tell me about the call again," Martha said suddenly. What exactly did Sarah say about the children? I repeated the conversation as best I could remember, watching Martha's face light up at the mention of Emma and James. She'd been devastated when we realized we might never be grandparents. All her friends had pictures on their phones, stories about soccer games, and dance recitals. Martha had learned to change the subject when the conversation turned to grandchildren. 8 and 5, she murmured. "Emma's probably in 2nd or 3rd grade. and James would be in kindergarten, maybe preschool. Sarah said, "Emma has my eyes." Martha smiled for the first time since we'd started driving. Her father's eyes, that serious look, like she's trying to solve the world's problems. We stopped for lunch in Flagstaff, sitting in a diner booth that reminded me of the place David and I used to go after his Little League games. He'd order chocolate chip pancakes every time, no matter what time of day it was, and tell me about every play of the game while syrup dripped down his chin. "Dad, did you see when I slid into second? Coach Miller said it was the best slide he'd seen all season." "I saw it, son. You looked like a real ball player out there." The pride in his eyes at my simple words. That's what I missed most, being the person whose approval mattered to him. "Norman?" Martha's voice pulled me back to the present. "You're thinking about him again." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The waitress refilled our coffee cups, and I noticed her name tag said, "Emma." A sign, maybe. "What if we can't connect with them?" Martha asked quietly. "The children, I mean. We've missed so much. They don't know us at all." "Kids are resilient," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "And they're David's children. There has to be something of him in them." "De part," but privately I worried about the same thing. What did I know about 8-year-old girls or 5-year-old boys in this day and age? When David was their age, we didn't have computers and cell phones and video games. We caught fireflies and built tree forts and played catch until the streetlights came on. Would Emma and James even be interested in an old man who still preferred books to tablets? The closer we got to Los Angeles, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. The traffic thickened, and the familiar stress of the city began to seep into our car. Martha pulled out the address Sarah had given us and started navigating. "Westwood," she read from her phone. "It says here it's a very nice area, expensive." I wasn't surprised. David had always been smart, ambitious. In high school, he'd talked about becoming an architect, designing buildings that would outlast him. I'd encouraged those dreams, helped him with his college applications, celebrated when he got into USC. Sarah had been a part of those celebrations. I remembered her at his graduation, beautiful and poised, her arm linked through David's as they posed for pictures. She'd seemed genuinely fond of us then, grateful that we'd raised such a wonderful man. When had that changed? When had we become the enemy? "Norman, look." Martha pointed to a road sign. "Westwood Boulevard, we're almost there." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. In a few minutes, I would see my son for the first time in 10 years. I would meet my grandchildren. The moment I'd dreamed about and given up hope for was finally here. But as we turned onto the residential street Sarah had directed us to, something felt wrong. The houses were beautiful, well-maintained, clearly expensive, but there was something unsettling about the quiet, the way the shadows fell across the empty driveways. "This is it," Martha said, checking the address against her notes. 2415 Westwood Drive. I pulled into the driveway of a 2-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn. No toys in the yard, no children's bicycles on the porch, no signs of life at all. The windows were dark, and when I looked closer, I could see newspapers piled up by the front door. My heart began to race, but not with excitement anymore. Something was very, very wrong. We sat in the car for a moment, staring at the silent house. Martha's face had gone pale, and I could see her hands shaking. "Maybe they're just running late," she whispered. But I knew better. After 67 years on this earth, you develop an instinct for these things. This wasn't a delay or a misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. As I reached for the car door handle, a voice called out from across the street. An elderly man in a gardening hat was waving at us from his front yard, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. What he was about to tell us would shatter everything we thought we knew about the last 10 years. Everything we thought we knew about our son. The elderly man shuffled across the street toward us, his weathered face creased with concern. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone carrying heavy news. Martha and I got out of the car, our legs unsteady after the long drive, and the growing certainty that something terrible was waiting for us. "Excuse me?" the man called out, removing his gardening gloves. "Are you folks looking for the Harrises? David and Sarah Harris?" My throat went dry. "Yes, we're his parents. Norman and Martha Jensen, we're here to visit." The man's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like pity. He glanced at the empty house, then back at us, clearly struggling with what to say. "I'm sorry, but there's been some kind of mistake," he said gently. "David and Sarah haven't lived in that house for years, not since the police took them away." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Martha grabbed my arm for support, her fingernails digging into my jacket. "Took them away?" I repeated, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "What do you mean, took them away?" The neighbor, who'd introduced himself as Mr. Patterson, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but they were arrested about 8 years ago now. The house has been empty ever since." 8 years? Sarah had called us just 5 days ago. She'd spoken about David's career, about the children, about this beautiful house in Westwood. All of it lies. "Arrested for what?" Martha whispered, though I could tell part of her didn't want to know the answer. Mr. Patterson shifted his weight, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Drugs? It was a big operation from what I heard. The FBI came with those white trucks, took boxes and boxes of evidence out of the house, made the evening news and everything." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My David, the boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar, involved in drugs serious enough to warrant an FBI investigation. "There has to be some mistake," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow. "Our son isn't involved in drugs. He's an architect. He's successful." Mr. Patterson's face softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, sir. I lived across the street from them for 3 years before the arrest. Nice enough neighbors, kept to themselves mostly. But there was definitely something going on. Strange cars coming and going at all hours. People who didn't look like they belonged in this neighborhood." Martha made a small sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, feeling her whole body trembling. "The children," she managed to say. "Sarah told us they had children, Emma and James." Mr. Patterson shook his head slowly. "No children, ma'am. Not while they lived here anyway, just the 2 of them." Another lie. The grandchildren Sarah had described in such vivid detail didn't exist. Emma with my eyes, little James who looked like David at that age, all fabrications designed to lure us here. But why? What could Sarah possibly hope to gain by bringing us to Los Angeles to find an empty house? "Where are they now?" I asked. "David and Sarah. Are they still in prison?" "Far as I know, the trial was a big deal around here. They got convicted on federal charges, so it would be a long sentence. 10 to 15 years, maybe more." The numbers crashed over me like cold water. My son, my only child, was in federal prison, had been for 8 years, and I'd never known. "Mr. Patterson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "do you know which prison, or have any other information about the case?" He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I saved some of the newspaper clippings from back then. My wife, God rest her soul, she was always cutting out articles about the neighborhood. If you'd like to come inside, I could show you what I have." Martha and I followed Mr. Patterson across the street to his modest bungalow. The living room was cluttered but clean, filled with the kind of furniture that spoke of a long marriage and a comfortable life. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a shoebox full of newspaper clippings. "Here we go," he said, pulling out a yellowed article from the Los Angeles Times. This was the main story when they got arrested. I took the newspaper with shaking hands. The headline read, "Westwood couple arrested in major drug distribution ring." Below it was a photograph that made my knees buckle. It was David. My David, but not the David I remembered. His face was thinner, harder somehow. Dark circles under his eyes, a hollow look that spoke of things I didn't want to imagine. He was being led away in handcuffs, his head down, avoiding the cameras. Beside him was Sarah, and she looked nothing like the charming young woman who'd married my son. Her hair was stringy, her clothes disheveled, but it was her eyes that disturbed me most. They were cold, calculating, even in the midst of being arrested. Martha read over my shoulder, her tears dropping onto the newsprint. The article detailed how federal agents had uncovered a sophisticated drug distribution network operating out of several upscale Los Angeles neighborhoods. David and Sarah Harris were described as key players in an operation that had been under investigation for 2 years. According to DEA sources, the article continued, the couple used their legitimate business contacts and social connections to distribute cocaine and methamphetamines to wealthy clients throughout the Los Angeles area. Harris, who worked as a freelance contractor, allegedly used construction sites as meeting points for drug transactions. A freelance contractor, not an architect. Another lie, or maybe David had never achieved the dreams we'd talked about in that workshop so many years ago. "There's more," Mr. Patterson said gently, handing me another clipping. This one was from the sentencing hearing, 8 months later. Local couple sentenced in drug conspiracy case. David had received 12 years in federal prison. Sarah got 10 years, apparently for cooperating with prosecutors and providing information about other members of the operation. 12 years. My son had been locked away for 8 years already, with 4 more to go. And Sarah, who'd called us just days ago, had somehow gotten access to a phone to lure us here. "I don't understand," Martha said, her voice barely audible. "Why would she call us? Why bring us here just to show us an empty house?" I was wondering the same thing, but a darker thought was beginning to form in my mind. Sarah had always been manipulative, always able to find angles that served her purposes. If she was still in prison, what could she possibly want from us? Money. It always came down to money. "Mr. Patterson," I said, "is there a way to find out which prison they're in? I need to see my son." "Well, federal prisoners are in the system online. You could look it up on one of those websites. My grandson showed me how to do it once." We spent the next hour in Mr. Patterson's living room, using his computer to search federal prison databases. What we found confirmed our worst fears and answered some of our questions. David Jensen Harris was currently incarcerated at Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution, about 30 miles south of Los Angeles. His earliest possible release date was 4 years from now, assuming good behavior. Sarah Mitchell Harris was listed at a women's federal prison in Dublin, California, about 400 miles north. But according to the records, she'd been transferred there only 2 months ago from a facility in Arizona. Close enough to Phoenix that she could have researched us, maybe even driven by our house. Close enough to know exactly what buttons to push to get us to come to Los Angeles. But we still didn't know why. Martha was crying quietly beside me, and I realized I was crying too. 8 years of wondering why our son had cut us out of his life. 8 years of believing we'd somehow failed as parents, that we'd driven him away with our love and concern. The truth was so much worse. David hadn't chosen to leave us. He'd been consumed by something dark and destructive, and Sarah had made sure we never knew about it. She'd used our love for our son as a weapon, keeping us away while she helped destroy his life. "We need to go see him," I said to Martha. "We need to go to that prison and see David." She nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue Mr. Patterson had provided. "But Norman, what if he doesn't want to see us? What if he's angry that we never tried to find him?" The question that had been haunting me since we'd read that first newspaper article. What if David thought we'd abandoned him? What if he believed we'd known about his arrest and chosen not to help? How do you explain to your child that you had no idea they were in prison because the person they married had spent 10 years lying to everyone? As we prepared to leave Mr. Patterson's house, thanking him for his kindness in the most difficult moment of our lives, I made a decision. Whatever we found at that prison, whatever David felt about our absence from his life, we were going to face it together. I'd lost 8 years with my son. I wasn't going to lose another day. The drive to Terminal Island felt like the longest 30 miles of my life. Martha sat beside me, clutching the visitor information we'd printed from the prison website. Her hands shook as she read through the regulations. No jewelry, no cell phones, no physical contact beyond a brief embrace at the beginning and end of the visit. We'd spent the night in a cheap motel near the airport, neither of us sleeping much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that newspaper photo of David in handcuffs, the hollow look in his eyes that spoke of a stranger wearing my son's face. "What if he won't see us?" Martha asked for the 10th time as we pulled into the prison parking lot. The facility looked like a concrete fortress surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. Nothing about it suggested hope or redemption. "Then we'll wait," I said, though my own stomach was churning with doubt. "We'll wait as long as it takes." The visiting process was dehumanizing. We were searched, questioned, and processed like we were the criminals. Our identification was checked multiple times, our backgrounds verified. Finally, after 2 hours of bureaucracy, we were led into a large room filled with plastic tables and chairs. And then I saw him. David walked through a door at the far end of the room, and my heart nearly stopped. He was thinner than in the newspaper photo, his dark hair now streaked with gray, though he was only 38 years old. He wore an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame, and his eyes swept the room nervously until they found us. The moment our eyes met, his face crumpled. He stood frozen for several seconds, as if he couldn't believe we were real. Then he started walking toward us, slowly at first, then faster. "Dad?" His voice was the same, though rougher now. "Dad, is that really you?" The guard allowed us a brief embrace, and I held my son for the first time in 10 years. He felt fragile in my arms, like he might break if I held him too tight. When we separated, tears were streaming down his face. "I can't believe you're here," he whispered as we sat down at one of the plastic tables. "I never thought I'd see you again." Martha reached across the table to take his hand, and I saw him flinch slightly before allowing the contact. Prison had taught him to be wary of human touch. "David," Martha said, her voice thick with tears, "we didn't know. We didn't know you were here. If we had known, we would have come immediately." His face showed confusion, then something that looked like hope. "You didn't know? But I thought... Sarah said you knew about the arrest. She said you were ashamed of me, that you didn't want anything to do with me anymore." The pieces of Sarah's deception began falling into place like a puzzle from hell. She'd told us David wanted space from his family. She'd told David we were ashamed and had abandoned him. She'd built a wall of lies that kept us apart for 8 years. "Sarah lied to us," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "She told us you didn't want to see us anymore, that we were too controlling, and needed to give you space to build your own life." David stared at us in disbelief. He said, "What?" "Dad, I tried to call you so many times in those first few years. Every time I was arrested. Every time I got out on bail. Sarah always said she'd contacted you, that you didn't want to help." My hands clenched into fists on the table. The depth of Sarah's manipulation was staggering. She'd systematically destroyed our family while making each of us believe the other had chosen the separation. "Tell us what happened," Martha said gently. "Help us understand how we got here." David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It started about a year after we got married. Sarah was working at a medical clinic and she started bringing home prescription pills. At first, it was just for stress," she said. "The job was demanding and she needed something to help her sleep." I remembered Sarah from those early days of their marriage. Beautiful, charming, ambitious. She'd seemed like the perfect wife for David, supportive of his dreams and career. "She got me to try them too," David continued. "Said they'd help with the anxiety I was feeling about work, about trying to establish my architecture practice. At first, it seemed harmless, just something to take the edge off. But it wasn't harmless," Martha said softly. David shook his head. "Within 6 months, we were both addicted. The pills became the most important thing in our lives. When the prescription sources dried up, Sarah found street dealers. When we couldn't afford street prices, she suggested we start selling to make money. The progression from victims to criminals painted a picture I recognized but had never wanted to see. Addiction was a disease I'd watched destroy other families in our neighborhood. I just never imagined it could touch ours. I tried to get clean several times," David said. "Every time I'd mention calling you and Mom asking for help, Sarah would talk me out of it. She said you'd never understand, that you'd judge us and make everything worse." "We would have helped," I said firmly, "whatever it took. We would have helped you get clean. I know that now. But at the time, I was so ashamed. The successful architect's son you'd raised was selling drugs out of his car and shooting up in gas station bathrooms. How do you tell your parents that you've become everything they taught you not to be? The pain in his voice was raw, immediate. This wasn't the abstract regret of someone telling an old story. This was fresh anguish, the wound of a man who'd spent 8 years reliving his mistakes. The worst part, David continued, was that I started to believe Sarah's version of events. When you didn't visit or call, I convinced myself that maybe you really had written me off. Maybe I really was beyond redemption. Martha was crying openly now, but she kept hold of David's hand. We never stopped loving you, not for one day. We just didn't know where you were or how to reach you. Sarah made sure of that, David said, and for the first time, I heard anger in his voice. She intercepted every attempt I made to contact you, changed our phone numbers without telling me the new ones, moved us to different apartments and didn't give me the addresses. The systematic nature of Sarah's deception was becoming clear. She hadn't just lied to us, she'd isolated David completely, making him dependent on her for every connection to the outside world. Why? I asked. Why would she want to keep us apart? David's expression darkened. Control. Sarah needed me to believe that she was the only person in the world who cared about me. As long as I thought you'd abandoned me, I wouldn't leave her no matter how bad things got. But you were arrested together, Martha pointed out. If she loved you, why didn't she try to protect you? Love, David laughed bitterly. Sarah didn't love me, Mom. I was useful to her. I had skills she needed for the business, connections from my legitimate work that she could exploit. When we got arrested, she made a deal with the prosecutors immediately, gave them information about everyone in our network, including me. The betrayal was complete. Sarah had destroyed our family, led my son into addiction and crime, then abandoned him to save herself when it all fell apart. She testified against me at sentencing, David added quietly. Told the judge that I was the leader of our operation, that she was just following my orders. Got her sentence reduced by 2 years. I felt a rage building in my chest, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This woman had systematically destroyed my son's life and kept us from helping him. She'd stolen 8 years from our family and was still trying to manipulate us from prison. David, I said carefully, Sarah called us 5 days ago. She's the one who brought us to Los Angeles. His eyes widened in shock. She called you? How? She's supposed to be in Dublin. We think she was transferred there recently from a facility in Arizona. She told us you wanted to see us, that you had children and were doing well. David's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally a kind of weary recognition. She's working an angle. Sarah always has an angle. If she contacted you, it's because she wants something. What could she possibly want from us now? Money for appeals lawyers, probably. Or she might be getting out soon and needs a place to land. Sarah's really good at finding people's weak spots and exploiting them. The manipulation was still continuing, even after 8 years of separation. Sarah had used our love for David to lure us to Los Angeles, probably hoping we'd be so grateful to find him that we'd do whatever she asked. She's not getting a penny from us, Martha said fiercely, and she's never getting near this family again. David smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. It was weak and uncertain, but it was genuine. I can't tell you how good it is to hear you say that. For so long, I thought I was completely alone. You're not alone, I said firmly. You're our son, and we're going to figure out how to move forward from here. We spent the rest of our visiting time talking about practical matters. David's release date, his plans for when he got out, the possibility of him coming to live with us in Phoenix while he got back on his feet. But underneath the logistics, something more important was happening. We were rebuilding the connection that Sarah had tried so hard to destroy. With each shared memory, each expression of love and regret, the wall between us crumbled a little more. When visiting time ended and we had to say goodbye, David hugged us both tightly. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for not giving up on me. As we walked back to our car, Martha and I were both emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. We'd found our son, and despite everything he'd been through, he was still David. Still the boy who'd worked beside me in the workshop, who'd dreamed of building something lasting. Sarah's lies had kept us apart for 8 years, but they couldn't destroy the fundamental bond between a father and son. Now we just had to make sure she never got the chance to hurt our family again. 3 days after visiting David, Sarah called again. I was in the garage, trying to distract myself by organizing tools, when Martha's voice cut through the afternoon quiet like a siren. "Norman! Norman, come quick, it's her again!" I found Martha standing in the kitchen, holding the phone like it might bite her. Her face was pale, and I could hear Sarah's voice coming through the speaker, sweet and concerned. "Martha, are you there? I've been so worried about you and Norman. Did you make it to Los Angeles safely?" I took the phone from Martha's trembling hands. My voice, when I spoke, was ice cold. "We made it, Sarah. We saw the house." There was a pause, just long enough for me to know she was recalculating her approach. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. "Oh, well, I hope you understand about the mix-up with the address. Things have been so complicated lately." "There was no mix-up, Sarah. We know where you are. We know where David is. We know everything." The silence stretched longer this time. When Sarah finally responded, the sweetness was gone from her voice, replaced by something harder. "I see. Well then, you know that David and I made some mistakes. But Norman, you have to understand, we were both struggling. The important thing is that we're trying to make things right now. By lying to us for 10 years, by keeping us away from our son while he was destroying his life. I was protecting him." Sarah's voice rose, cracking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "You don't understand what it was like. David was so ashamed, so convinced that you'd reject him if you knew the truth. I was trying to spare him that pain. The audacity of it took my breath away. Even now, even caught in her lies, Sarah was trying to paint herself as David's protector. You kept him from getting help," I said. "You kept him addicted and isolated so you could control him." "That's not true." But there was less conviction in her voice now. "Look, Norman, I know you're angry. You have every right to be, but we can't change the past. What matters now is David's future." And there it was, the angle David had predicted. Sarah wasn't calling to apologize or explain. She was calling because she wanted something. "What do you want, Sarah?" Another pause, and when she spoke again, the manipulative sweetness was back in full force. "David's getting out in 4 years, Norman. 4 years. He's going to need support, guidance, a place to start over. He's going to need family. He has family. He has us. Of course he does. But he's also going to need financial support. Prison doesn't exactly prepare someone for re-entering society. And there are legal matters to consider, appeals that could get him out sooner if we had the right representation. Money, just like David had predicted." "How much?" I asked bluntly. "Well, there's a lawyer in San Francisco who specializes in federal appeals. He thinks he could get David's sentence reduced by at least 2 years, maybe more. His retainer is $50,000. $50,000. Sarah was asking for more money than Martha and I had saved in 5 years. And why exactly would we give money to you instead of directly to David or his lawyer? Because I'm still his wife, Norman. Legally, I'm his next of kin. I can make decisions about his legal representation that you can't." The claim hit me like a physical blow. In all the shock of discovery, I hadn't considered the legal reality. Sarah was still married to David. Despite everything she'd done, she still had legal rights that superseded ours. "Besides," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a pleading tone, "I want what's best for David, too. I know I made mistakes, but I love him. I want him to have a chance at a real life when he gets out. If you love him, why did you testify against him at sentencing? I was trying to save us both. If I hadn't cooperated, we would have gotten much longer sentences. At least this way, we'll both be out while we're still young enough to start over." The rationalization was smooth, practiced. I could hear how Sarah had convinced herself that betraying David was actually an act of love. "Think about it, Norman," she pressed. $50,000 could give David 2 extra years of freedom. 2 years to rebuild his life, to reconnect with his family. Isn't that worth it? I looked at Martha, who was listening to every word with growing horror. We'd never had $50,000 to spare. We were living on Social Security and my modest pension. Even if we had the money, giving it to Sarah felt like rewarding her for destroying our family. "I need to think about it," I said finally. "Of course. But Norman, don't take too long. Legal appeals have deadlines, and this lawyer is in high demand. If we wait too long, David might miss his chance." The pressure tactic was obvious, but effective. Sarah was counting on our desperation to help David, our guilt over the lost years, to override our common sense. After I hung up, Martha and I sat at our kitchen table in stunned silence. The coffee in our cups grew cold as we processed what Sarah was asking of us. "She's still manipulating us," Martha said finally. "Even from prison, she's still finding ways to hurt this family." I nodded, but part of me was torn. What if Sarah was telling the truth about the appeals lawyer? What if $50,000 really could get David out 2 years early? "Norman," Martha said, reading my thoughts, "you can't seriously be considering this. What if it's real? What if we could actually help him get out sooner? Then we'd find a way to help him directly, without going through her. We'd hire our own lawyer, do our own research. We wouldn't hand money over to the woman who spent the last decade lying to us." She was right, of course, but the temptation was still there. The chance to fix something, to make up for lost time, to prove to David that we'd do anything for him. Over the next few days, I found myself researching federal appeals processes, looking into lawyers who specialized in sentence reductions. What I discovered was sobering. Most appeals failed. The chances of getting a significant sentence reduction were slim, especially for someone who'd already served 8 years of a 12-year sentence. But there were exceptions. Cases where new evidence emerged, where prosecutorial misconduct was discovered, where sentencing guidelines had changed. It wasn't impossible. Martha grew increasingly worried as she watched me dive deeper into legal research. She found me one morning at 3 a.m., hunched over my laptop, reading case law. "This has to stop," she said, sitting down beside me. "You're making yourself sick over this. What if we're making a mistake? What if there really is a chance to help him? Then we'll help him the right way. We'll visit him again, talk to him about his options. We'll find our own lawyer if that's what it takes, but we will not give money to Sarah." The next day, Sarah called again. This time, her tone was more urgent. "Norman, I've been thinking about our conversation. I understand your hesitation, I really do. But I have some news that might change your mind." "What news?" "David doesn't know I'm trying to help him with this appeal. He's given up hope, convinced himself that he deserves to serve the full sentence. If you could see him, Norman, if you could see how defeated he's become." Another manipulation, but this one cut deeper because it contained a grain of truth. David had seemed resigned during our visit, like he'd accepted that prison was where he belonged. "What are you suggesting?" "I think it would be better if this appeal happens without David knowing about it initially. Let the lawyer do his work, and then we can surprise David with the good news. Think about how much hope it would give him to know that his family fought for his freedom." The scenario Sarah painted was seductive. Walking into that prison visiting room and telling David that we'd found a way to get him out early, seeing his face light up with hope for the first time in years. But Martha's voice cut through my fantasy. "She's lying again," she said quietly. "Can't you see that? She's telling you what you want to hear." That night, I called the lawyer Sarah had mentioned. His office was closed, but I left a message asking for information about David's case. The next morning, he called back. "Mr. Jensen, I understand you're inquiring about David Harris. I have to tell you, I've never heard of this case. I certainly haven't been retained to work on any appeals." The lie was so brazen, so easily disproven, that it took my breath away. Sarah hadn't just exaggerated or bent the truth. She'd fabricated the entire story. When I told Martha what I'd discovered, she didn't look surprised. "She was never going to use that money for David's appeal," Martha said. "She was going to use it for herself, maybe to hire a lawyer for her own case or to have money waiting when she gets out." I felt like a fool for even considering Sarah's request. But more than that, I felt angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my 67 years. This woman had destroyed my son's life, stolen 10 years from our family, and now she was trying to scam us out of our life savings, using our love for David as bait. When Sarah called that evening for my answer, I was ready. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm and controlled, "I've made my decision." "Oh, wonderful. I knew you'd do the right thing for David. Where should I have the lawyer contact you about the payment arrangements?" "You misunderstood me. My decision is no. We're not giving you any money, now or ever." The silence that followed was electric with rage. "You're making a mistake, Norman. You're condemning your own son to 2 extra years in prison because you're too stubborn to trust me. I'm protecting my family from you, just like I should have done 10 years ago. You'll regret this, Sarah said, her voice turning vicious. When David finds out that his own parents chose their money over his freedom, you'll regret this decision for the rest of your life. David will never hear that story from you, I said firmly, because you're never speaking to any of us again. I hung up and immediately blocked her number. Then I called the prison and added Sarah's name to a list of people who were not allowed to contact David about our family. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I'd made the right choice. Sarah had tried one last time to destroy our family, and she'd failed. Now we could focus on what really mattered, rebuilding our relationship with David and making sure he knew he wasn't alone anymore. 2 years passed like pages turning in a book we were finally allowed to read together. Every month, Martha and I made the drive from Phoenix to Terminal Island, 6 hours each way, to spend 2 precious hours with David in that sterile visiting room. But those visits became the highlight of our lives. The first few months were tentative, careful. We were all learning how to be a family again, navigating around the crater that Sarah's lies had left in our lives. David was suspicious of his own hope, afraid to believe that we really wanted him back. Martha and I were walking on eggshells, terrified of saying something that might remind him of the years we'd lost. But gradually, slowly, the walls came down. David started telling us about his life in prison. Not the dramatic stories you see in movies, but the quiet realities of institutional life. He'd become a tutor in the education program, helping other inmates get their GEDs. He'd learned to repair computers in the vocational training center. He'd even started attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings, working through the addiction that had derailed his life. "I've been clean for 8 years now," he told us during one visit, his voice carrying a quiet pride I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "Longer than I was using. Sometimes I think that's the only good thing that came out of this place. It forced me to get sober." Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Physical contact was limited, but the guards had grown used to seeing us and were less strict about brief touches. "Your father and I have been going to Nar-Anon meetings," she said, "learning about addiction, about how to support you when you get out." David's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, we did," I said firmly. "We lost 10 years because we didn't understand what you were going through. We're not losing any more time to ignorance." Those meetings had been hard for us, sitting in a circle with other families destroyed by addiction, hearing stories that could have been our own if we'd known the truth. But they'd also been healing. We learned that addiction was a disease, not a moral failing. We learned that loving someone with addiction meant setting boundaries while keeping doors open. Most importantly, we learned that recovery was possible. The breakthrough came during our 8th visit, about 6 months after we'd reconnected. David had been quiet during most of our conversation, picking at his fingernails the way he used to do as a child when something was bothering him. "Dad," he said suddenly, "I need to tell you something about why I really started using drugs." Martha and I exchanged glances. We'd been careful not to push David to share more than he was comfortable with, but we'd both sensed there were deeper layers to his story. "It wasn't just peer pressure or curiosity," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I was scared, terrified actually. "Scared of what, son?" "Of failing, of not living up to your expectations. You always believed in me so much, Dad. You were so proud when I got into architecture school, so excited about my future, and I was struggling, really struggling." The words came out in a rush, like water through a broken dam. My grades were terrible my last year of college. I was barely going to graduate, let alone get into a good architecture firm. I felt like I was disappointing everyone, especially you. When Sarah offered me those pills, they made everything seem manageable again. The anxiety went away, and I could focus. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. My son had started down the path to addiction because he was afraid of disappointing me. "David," I said, my voice shaking, "I would never have been disappointed in you for struggling in school. Never. I know that now. But I was 22 and stupid and scared, and Sarah was there, telling me that you'd never understand, that successful parents like you couldn't relate to failure. Another piece of Sarah's manipulation revealed. She'd used David's insecurities about my expectations to drive a wedge between us, making him believe that our love was conditional on his success. "Your mother and I love you," I said firmly. "Not your achievements, not your career, not your success. You. We love you exactly as you are, and we always have." David broke down completely then, sobbing like the frightened young man he'd been when Sarah first got her claws into him. The other visitors in the room pretended not to notice, giving us what privacy they could in that public space. When visiting time ended that day, something fundamental had shifted. The last barrier between us had crumbled, and David finally believed that our love was real and unconditional. The phone calls started after that, short conversations twice a week, limited by prison regulations but precious beyond measure. David would tell us about his classes, his work assignments, his hopes for the future. We'd share news from home, stories about the neighbors, updates on Martha's garden. Normal family conversations, the kind we should have been having all along. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I get out," David said during one call. "I don't think I want to go back to architecture. Too much pressure, too many triggers, but I'd like to work with my hands again. Maybe construction or furniture making." "Do you remember that old workshop in the garage?" I asked. "It's still there, waiting for you." The silence on the other end was loaded with emotion. "Really? You kept it?" "I never took it down. I think I always hoped you'd come back to it someday." That Christmas, we were allowed a special video call. David appeared on our computer screen wearing his orange jumpsuit, but smiling genuinely for the first time in years. Martha had decorated the background of our call with Christmas lights, and I could see David's eyes light up at the sight. "It looks just like home," he said. "It is home," Martha replied, "and you'll be here for the next one." Because by then we'd gotten the news we'd been hoping for. David's exemplary behavior in prison, combined with completion of several rehabilitation programs, had earned him early release. He'd be out in 8 months, with 2 years of parole to follow. The real work began then. We spent months preparing for David's return, not just emotionally but practically. We researched halfway houses, job training programs, parole requirements. We baby-proofed our expectations, understanding that David's transition back to civilian life would be challenging. The day David was released, Martha and I drove to Terminal Island before dawn. We wanted to be the first faces he saw as a free man. When the prison doors opened and David walked out, carrying a small bag of possessions, I barely recognized him. He'd gained healthy weight during his last year inside. His hair was neatly trimmed, his posture straight, but it was his eyes that showed the biggest change. The hollow, defeated look was gone, replaced by something I'd thought we'd lost forever: hope. The drive back to Phoenix was surreal. David sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the desert landscape like he'd never seen it before. Every few minutes, he'd reach over and touch my arm or Martha's hand, as if reassuring himself that we were real. "I can't believe I'm actually here," he said as we pulled into our driveway. "I can't believe you waited for me." "We didn't wait," I corrected him. "We just lived our lives knowing that someday you'd be part of them again." That first month was an adjustment for all of us. David slept on our couch, worked part-time at a furniture restoration shop, and attended mandatory parole meetings twice a week. He was quiet, careful, still learning how to exist in the world outside prison walls. But gradually he relaxed. He started laughing at my bad jokes again. He helped Martha with her garden, his hands remembering the patience required to nurture growing things. He spent hours in the workshop reacquainting himself with tools he hadn't touched in over a decade. 6 months after his release, David found his own apartment. Small but clean and close enough that he could bike over for Sunday dinners. He'd been promoted to assistant manager at the restoration shop, and his boss was talking about helping him start his own business, eventually. "I want to specialize in fixing things that other people throw away," David told us over dinner one night. "Furniture that's damaged, but not destroyed. There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it beautiful again." I understood what he meant. We were all learning about restoration, about taking broken things and finding ways to make them whole. The final piece of healing came unexpectedly, 18 months after David's release. He was helping me organize the garage when he found a box of his childhood photos that Martha had saved. "Look at this," he said, holding up a picture of the two of us working in the shop when he was about 10 years old. "I remember this day. We were building that bookshelf for my room." I looked at the photo, seeing the concentration on both our faces as we worked side by side. "You know what I remember about that day?" I said. "Not the bookshelf. I remember thinking that I was the luckiest father in the world because I got to share something I loved with someone I loved." David set the photo down and looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I thought I'd lost that forever, the feeling of being your son." "You never lost it," I said firmly. "It was always there, waiting for you to come home." We stood there in the garage, surrounded by the tools and workbenches that had waited patiently for his return, and I realized that Sarah hadn't won after all. She'd stolen years from us, caused immeasurable pain, but she hadn't destroyed the fundamental bond between father and son. Some connections are stronger than lies. Some love survives even the deepest betrayal. David is 39 now, rebuilding his life one careful day at a time. He runs his own furniture restoration business, has a small house with a workshop in the back, and visits us every Sunday for dinner. He's been clean for 10 years and talks openly about his addiction with young people who are struggling with the same demons he faced. Sarah was released from prison last year. She tried to contact David once, through a mutual acquaintance, but he declined to respond. He's moved on, and so have we. Sometimes I think about the 10 years we lost, the grandchildren who might have been, the memories that were stolen from us. But more often, I think about the years we've been given back. The Sunday dinners, the quiet conversations in the workshop, the simple miracle of having my son home. Recovery isn't about returning to what was. It's about building something new from what remains. And what remains, I've learned, is always enough.